Good afternoon. Nice to see you all and welcome. It is with pleasure that I welcome you to the session on Putting Science in Context, the future of social sciences in risk analysis. This is a topic that's dear to my heart. I'm Domagoj Vrbos from EFSA, team leader at the strategic communication team, also responsible for social research at EFSA. This presentation, in one way or another, will address the three things we heard yesterday. First of all, we heard that you might not expect a session talking about social sciences in a scientific conference on food safety. Well, we'll see today that we've prepared something that we hope will be useful, that will give us some insights on how we can continue on building on this. The second thing is that trust underpins a sustainable food safety system. This is another topic that is quite important for us and that we think we will be addressing today through various presentations. And third, we've seen that there are two factors that have been mentioned as sort of marking the way we communicate in our information systems today, which is the blurring of the boundaries as well as the digital revolution. So really, what we want to do today is we want to try to give you an overview of the developments and the thinking in these areas, but also what really matters, the practitioners. How do people do this? What are the examples? And what are the good elements that we can pick up as EFSA or as other agencies to bring this to our institutions? So this is me, I'm your chair today. But before I start talking about the session structure, I want to talk a bit about how we came to this session. Basically, back in 2018, in the scientific conference that we had at EFSA, we held a session on communicating to and engaging with the public and regulatory science. And this was basically the first time that we had a session that focused a bit in a scientific conference on these topics. So we had speakers talking about communication and communication practices. We had some speakers talking about engagement. And we took a lot of takeaways from that session. In fact, one of the important things that we always wondered, and that I wondered when I joined EFSA, was how do you use social science in risk communication, and how do you maintain effective management? So we had a lot of recommendations on how to do social research, what type of social research we could implement in an organization like EFSA. Where is the boundary? Because we know there are boundaries. What can be done as social research for risk communication? What can be done for risk assessment, what can be done for risk management, and as well, how can we use these insights to maintain engagement? So we've built a function, and in the meantime, a lot of things have changed. First of all, a lot of organizations globally have started implementing social science. There are networks of organizations that work in these areas, and we will have speakers from these organizations today in Europe and around the world. There have been a lot of developments in the methodologies. So we will hear today, I've said there are at least 2 presentations with the hashtag social science method. So we will see those presentations and we will see what we have learned. Also, thinking of disruptive external events. We've had COVID, and COVID we've seen and addressed in every session of this conference, and I think it will be keep addressed because COVID was one of those things that really taught us that science can come into the center of public debate. And also, the role of science has really been prominent in COVID. So we will see today how some of these events have, in a way, also pulled with themselves social science and what it can do in policies. And finally, technology advancements. Of course, we've heard about this yesterday. We talk about this all the time. But even in social research, you can apply new technologies. There are so many methods that we can use and so many things. So all that said, I think with that in mind, we've designed the session today. The session today is about putting science into context. So we'll hear a lot of speakers from different angles, and we will really, what I want from you to take away from this session is what you think as practitioners in the risk analysis process could be the value added of social science. I'll explain a bit the structure of the session, what's coming up. So basically, we have 3 parts. This session has 3 parts. First, there's a part on society and science. In this part, we will talk a bit about the paradigm shift of including, let's say, scientists and society in the scientific process in a more transparent and inclusive manner. We will hear talks, and we will have a Q&A session. That same will work for the second part, which is the communication in digital age. So basically, the structure of each part is the same. You have a keynote, which talks a bit about the development, in general, about the science, or maybe some of the recommendations that are stemming at the global level. And then you have 3 flash talks from practitioners. And then after these 3 flash talks, we have a Q&A session. So we'll repeat this twice, once for engagement, once for communication in digital age. And we have an impressive list of speakers. Hopefully they all connect. I'm kidding. UNESCO, we have the European Center of Disease Control, the Joint Research Center, NASA, University of Cambridge. We have a video from an information designer working specifically on scientific data. We have the Food Standards Agency of the UK, and as well Infarm that's working on vertical farming. So this will be the session for the first hour and 45 minutes. Then we'll have a coffee break. And then after the coffee break, we'll have a panel discussion on paving the road for the future role society in one policy making. And our 2 keynotes will join us. They will be there with us. And who will join us on the stage is our head of communication unit at EFSA, James Ramsey, and the member of the European Parliament, Rose Montserrat, who has a vote, but we were told she should make it. This will be moderated by Professor Lofstad from the King's College of London. So with that in mind, I want to make a last point, and then I'll start introducing the first speaker. This is a session on social science, but it's also a session on communication in the digital age. So because it's a session on communication in the digital age, we do have a lot of remote speakers. And I think this is a point we also wanted to make, that we have some people here, but we want to hear from the experts that are around the world, and we are really proud of the list of speakers that we have today and honored to have them connected with us today. So I think with no further ado, I'll introduce the first speaker. And who better to start a session on social science than a natural scientist? So I think this is what we want to do. So we have Dr. Anna Persic from the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Anna is a program specialist at the section of Science, Policy and Partnership in the natural sciences sector, and she's an ecologist by profession, and her work relates to strengthening the science-policy interface and the promotion of science, technology and innovation. And what Anna will talk to us today is about the UNESCO recommendation of opening up science to science and society. So it's a global recommendation that stems from the SDGs that talks about how we should open science and be more inclusive in the scientific process with different members of society. So with that, Anna, I hand over to you. Thank you so much for being here. And
thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Domagoj, and many thanks for the invitation and for the presentation. I'm very happy to be here. It is true that when first the invitation arrived, I said, listen, I am a natural scientist. I don't really know how to talk about social science, but then we understood that indeed what is important at this stage and in this particular presentation is just to present some of the major development in the scientific world, which really stem towards and can kind of push towards a bigger engagement of science with society and with policy, and a better collaboration between the different scientists around the world, including between different disciplines. So I hope this presentation will put some light and highlight some of these latest developments. And in particular, I would like to talk about what we have been doing in UNESCO in this context for the past 2 years, and that was to kind of develop an international standard setting instrument, international norms framework for open science. So I believe you all see my screen, and I'll maybe just to start by saying that the work on open science in UNESCO comes from the fact that we have really seen that science cuts across all the different United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There is not one single goal, and probably not even many targets, that can actually be achieved without some kind of integration of science, technology, innovation, as well as an integration of sciences and different disciplines, including social and natural sciences. So whether it's economic goals, social goals, or environmental sustainability goals, science really does cut across all of these different goals. However, to achieve these SDGs, it is really important also that we have some more innovative ways in which we do science, in which we engage amongst different scientists, in which we share information, and in which we engage with society. There is a need indeed to democratize science, as well as the entire scientific process, and make it more efficient, equitable, transparent, and inclusive. So really there is a need at the international level and then regional, national levels for a more open science. And then, of course, with COVID-19, we've seen how important it is to have timely and free access to scientific data, publication, and information. How important it is that we have scientific collaborations and sharing of information at all the various levels, and how important it is to have a well-functioning dialogue between science, policy, and society. And again, we've seen the need for open science. And maybe one of the interesting indicators of how science can be more open is just by looking into access to different scientific publications. So in general, we have around 70% of all scientific publications that are locked behind some kind of paywalls. You have to pay in one way or another to be able to access that information in scientific articles. With COVID-19 publications, it's exactly the opposite. We have more than 85% of publications that are actually open access, that you can access without necessarily providing any fees. So it is possible in situations like COVID. The question is, how do we make it a rule and not an exception in the scientific world? So as I said, in the past 10, 20 years, we have seen the growth of this global movement of open science within the open access community, open data community, open software, of course, community. But and we've seen some initiatives at regional levels or institutional levels. However, like a global international framework for policy and action was missing. And that is the reason why UNESCO member states, 193 countries, decided that there is need for UNESCO to develop this international policy framework with a common definition, with a shared set of values and principles for open science. So UNESCO recommendations, as I said, are legal instruments in which the General Conference, which is the ensemble of all the different member states, formulates principles and norms to regulate at the international level a particular question. So the UNESCO recommendation on open science is indeed provides this framework for the questions of open science. So we've held for 2 years a series, since 2019 to 2021, a series of global, regional, thematic, multi-stakeholder consultations, because we really wanted to understand what open science means for different disciplines, for different actors, for different regions, for different countries, different institutions. And we realized that the open science community is very broad, that there are very many different actors involved, and that they do not necessarily all kind of come together under this joint umbrella of open science. And the reason why the recommendation on open science, which was developed by UNESCO and eventually adopted by UNESCO member states in November last year, I think the power of that recommendation is that really it provides this global definition of open science that is very broad and that captures the different elements of open science and the different key features of open science. So in terms of the definition that is now given in the recommendation, the open science really is a set of different movements to make scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable, that increase scientific collaboration, sharing of information, not just between the scientists, but also between the scientists and a broader society, and that opens the process of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community. It is very clear in the recommendation also that when we talk about open science movement, it really does bring together all scientific disciplines and aspects of scholarly practice, including basic and applied sciences, natural social sciences, and humanities. And in terms of the different elements that we have defined in the recommendations, that the countries have defined in the recommendation. We have open scientific knowledge, which includes open access to publications, open data, educational resources, open source and software, and even open hardware. Then open science infrastructures, both digital repositories as well as physical infrastructures. Open engagement of societal actors, a very important feature, including actions like citizen science or voluntary science, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, and then the open dialogue with other knowledge systems, including indigenous knowledge holders and traditional knowledge. So the idea is really for science to be able to respond to the challenges that we have today and find solutions from local to international level. We really do need a bigger engagement of society and try to pull together all the different types of knowledge to solve these issues. The recommendation also defines a set of values and principles of open science, and we're talking about, of course, scientific quality and integrity, which is the core value of open science, but also collective benefit, equity and fairness, diversity and inclusiveness. So we really are moving towards the idea of science as a global public good. And then the different principles which make sure that these values are maintained and that they are operationalized in activities and in practices: transparencies, scrutiny, critique, equality of opportunities, collaboration, flexibility, and sustainability, among others. So I really do encourage you to have a look at the recommendation, because it really does give you a very good idea of what open science is, but even more of where science should go. It really should be just science, not necessarily open science. This is how science should function. The member states have also decided to introduce some key objectives or areas of action, with a series of actions recommended at different levels. And these actions really range from promoting a common understanding of open science, developing an enabling policy environment, investment in infrastructures and services, in training and human capacity and institutional capacity, in fostering more broadly a culture of open science, aligning incentives, promotion of innovative approaches, and international multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary collaboration at all levels. Of course, we do realize that there is a series of challenges to implement open science, again, in different disciplines, in different areas of the world at different levels. And the biggest one is really the need for a change in the conventional scientific culture. We have grown somehow to have an actually closed scientific processes, whereas science at its basis really was more of an open process, and it should go back to being more of an open process. Capacity building, of course, for open science. All of these different actions and practices require additional capacity building, investment in adequate infrastructures, and particular also internet connectivity, alignment of incentives, which very often also really means revision of criteria for evaluation of scientific excellence and scientific careers. So stepping away from quantitative evaluation indicators, age indexes, and others, and really trying to understand what is the impact of science, and try to figure out an evaluation system that takes into account a broad range of qualities for scientific careers and evaluation of scientific success. And then, of course, there is need to address some of these unintended negative consequences of open science practices, such as possibly high article processing charges, some predatory behaviors, and some possible exploitation and privatization of research data, which is open. However, there are different ways in which these issues can be addressed, and the idea is really that we share best practices and understand how to best anchor open science across the world. Now, in terms of implementation of the recommendation, really at the international level, we need to accompany our member states in the implementation, and we will, from the Secretariat, with the help of the open science community that we've created, develop a series of supporting tools. But also, we really are keen on collecting best practices and sharing them, analyzing the mechanisms for financing, looking into what are the different incentives that have to be put in place, What are the open science policies, how they have to be conceived, building capacity, and developing a monitoring framework. Because what is important is that the member states who have adopted the recommendation have to go back to UNESCO every 4 years and report to the progress made. So there is a reporting mechanism that is going to be very important going forward. It really, if open science is implemented in the way it should be, and if it really is a global endeavor with collaborations across disciplines and collaboration across continents, it really does have the potential to increase the accessibility, quality of science, make scientific process and its outputs more accessible, transparent, collaborative, and inclusive. It is very important for us from the UNESCO perspective because it can be open science a game changer in terms of bridging the science technology innovation gaps and also fulfilling the human right to science as it is in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And then, of course, as we said, the open science is increasingly recognized as a critical SDG accelerator, and there is a lot of talks at the level of the UN as to how do we promote open science across the different nations. In terms of engagement in the process, we really do encourage the audience and all the different participants to join the UNESCO Open Science Partnership. It's easy. You just send us a letter and we evaluate, and you're part of the family, you're part of the partnership. We launch calls very often. So we have 2 calls right now, one for open science policies and another one for best practices. We have working groups that are working across the different key challenges, let's say, and there is still space for everybody. So we would be very happy to have members of your community also participating in these working groups, and then just be in touch with regards to what is happening in open science in UNESCO. So I will leave you with that, and I hope that this just gives a little flavor and a context for the next few talks, and I'll be very happy to respond to any of your future questions. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Anna. That was a great talk, and that was a broad recommendation, really, stemming from the UN, but it has many little things covered. If you read the global recommendation on open science, there are many things that are included. And the 3 things that, when we read the recommendation, really, sounded good to us and we wanted to highlight today was that the areas of the recommendation include science communication, open engagement of societal actors beyond the scientific community, understanding citizens, engaging them in research, and implementing tools such as citizen science. And these were the 3 things from the recommendation that we picked and for which we wanted to bring today to you 3 practitioners that are working in these areas. So for our next talk, I am more than happy to announce, and thank you, Anna, again. We will come back to you in the Q&A session that's coming soon. For the next talk, I want to announce a colleague of mine from the European Center for Disease Control, a medical anthropologist. So our first light talk really comes from a true social and behavioral change researcher. Hi, John.
Hello there.
I just want to introduce John, who is very active in our social science network among the NV agencies that organize this conference. John has conducted social science and behavior change research since 1996, including on the social determinants of health. He's worked on HIV, AIDS, Ebola, Zika, and most recently COVID. He joined ECDC back in 2019, and he worked on all the hot topics for the social scientists, the promoting vaccination acceptance, pandemic fatigue, supporting socially vulnerable population, and countering online vaccination misinformation. So his flash talk will focus on behavioral insights in support of the response to COVID. John, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this really fantastic conference. I think it's such a wonderful opportunity and to be with such a high level of colleagues talking. I wish I was able to be with you in the audience there, and I'm so sorry to be sitting here in Stockholm, but nonetheless, here we are. So what I want to do is to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done at ECDC over the course of the pandemic. And for those of you who don't know, ECDC is the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, and it's an EU agency, and basically our task and our mandate is to work towards protecting EU countries from infectious disease outbreaks. So obviously COVID was a very tough challenge for us all, and we had a lot to do during this period. My own background, I'm a medical anthropologist, and so I am employed by ECDC to work on behavioral insights research. Now, what does that actually mean? We've just heard about the whole paradigm of moving into open science and things like this. We're also, when we're talking about behavioral insights research, it's also part of that same paradigm shift. Essentially, what we're looking at here is aiming to provide understandings of people's behavioral choices, barriers, and drivers. That's not new in itself, but what is new is the emphasis that is being given to it by authorities across the European Union. Within the context of COVID, when BI or behavioral insights has become absolutely critical, it's really been in two key areas. The first of those is facilitating adherence to what we describe as non-pharmaceutical interventions, by which basically we're talking about physical distancing, staying at home, closures of shops and gyms and so on, the things that keep us apart, essentially. We're also talking about promotion of vaccination, COVID vaccination. So these are extremely difficult areas, different areas, but BI, behavioral insights, has a huge role in both of them. If you don't have any empirical understanding of what's driving people either to adhere or not to adhere to your NPIs, to your non-pharmaceutical interventions, or to be vaccinated, your policies and your communication strategies are essentially shooting in the dark. And that means it's wasting resources, it's costing money, it's wasting time, and it's not having the effect that you want. There's many, many, many areas that I could talk about in terms of exactly what BI has done. This is just one example of countless, and it comes from France, and it shows here 4 different lines in different colors, and they're to do with some of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, whether it's to do with masks or shaking hands, washing hands, or to do with avoiding large groups of people. And this is based on survey data that's been collected over time, so you can have a sense of trends. And you can see particularly the green line, which is about avoiding groups of people. There's been a lot of changes in that over the course of the pandemic. It's basically gone from quite high to quite low, whereas wearing a mask in public places has gone from quite low to quite high. So you can have a sense of what people are doing and how they're behaving. And that gives policymakers a good idea of how they should be targeting their communication strategies and their policies. This is clearly quantitative, but you can also do qualitative BI research that can provide the whys and the hows. We see here what is happening, but we don't know necessarily why, how it's happening. So other types of qualitative research can be done to help us there. To what extent has BI been facilitated, the understanding of the importance of BI through the pandemic? Well, I think, as I said, we're talking about paradigm shifts. There has been a very wide recognition throughout the course of the pandemic of why BI is important. Risk communication strategies have been guided. Authorities know to a much better extent what people are willing to accept and what they're not willing to accept with regards to the different measures, the different restrictions. And also, of course, it's been critical in understanding vaccine confidence and why people may not be vaccinated. However, very importantly, we will note that in most countries, BI is not fully integrated into the whole preparedness and response system. And you can see here, this map shows a bunch of red countries, which are countries which took part in the survey that we did here, which was aimed at all of the EU. But you can see that much of the EU towards the east and central and southern side isn't there. That's because we weren't able to reach out to the people. The systems aren't in place to actually even identify who these people are. So across the EU, there is an imbalance, and we can also say that there is a general underrepresentation in a lot of the COVID management teams at national level of social and behavioral science. So the paradigm is shifting, but we need it to shift more. So what do we need to do? This is my last slide. The crisis of COVID has really, really represented a huge opportunity to understand and to really make clear in people's minds that unless we understand human behavior, unless we understand social and cultural context, our interventions won't work. So what we need to do now, we need to highlight the achievements that we have made over the course of the pandemic. We need to institutionalize and embed behavioral insights into our country's pandemic preparedness and response activities. And critically, because memories are short, people are moving on already into, as we all know, the next crisis. We need to do this now, because otherwise all of the expertise, all of the infrastructure that we have gained at such pain over the last 2 years may be lost. And so that was really my pitch there. We've made a huge amount of progress. We need to hold on to it, and we need to institutionalize it before we lose it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for that talk. A very interesting topic on inclusion of behavioral sciences and insights into also policy making with the COVID example. We're not all digital. We have some speakers here. So after this, we're moving a bit back towards the science policy interface, and a natural scientist again, biologist by training. We have Anne-Katrin Bock, who is the head of Competence Center on Foresight in the European Commission's Joint Research Center in Brussels. Anne-Katrin has her recent work, she's been working on foresight since 2012 actually, but her recent work includes projects such as concepts for an EU sustainable food system, farmers of the future, and long-term scenarios for EU rural areas. All of this very much linked to some of the global challenges that we've seen yesterday in the opening session. Anne-Katrin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you here today. I'm very happy to be in the room and not online, I have to admit. After 2 years of COVID, it's a very positive change. I'm glad to present to you today practical example of engaging with stakeholders that we do in the context of our work to support the EU policymaking with innovative approaches as well as with future-oriented insights. So the project I would like to focus on is a recent one. It is linked to the development of the legislative framework for sustainable food systems. So you're probably well aware of this policy initiative. It's one of the flagship initiatives of the Farm to Fork strategy, and it's currently under development by the European Commission. This project that we carried out reflects a bit the general interest of the European Commission in testing out new ways of generating input and stakeholder engagement into policymaking, but it also reflects the need for different approaches to deal with the complexity of such a systemic legislative initiative. So what we were tasked with was to design and carry out a reflection process together with number of participants to generate insights into how such a legislative framework could look like, what could be the key building blocks of such a legislative framework, and to produce collective but non-binding advice to support the policy making at a very early stage actually in the process. It is a pilot exercise and it's complementing other formats of stakeholder interaction and engagement that exist, and also other formats, of course, of evidence gathering. So what we did was to gather an inclusive and broad international group of people that we selected based on their expertise to cover most aspects of the food system, which are many. So we gathered more than 40 people from academia, from policy, from business, civil society organizations, the EU agencies, and international organizations. And we carried out a rather intensive, unfortunately only online process with them. So within 3 months, we had over 30 online sessions, differing in formats, so usually small sessions with different combinations of the participants, and also some plenary sessions with everybody. So to just briefly tell you the main steps that we carried out. So we started with generating a food actors map, so to bring basically everybody on the same page to understand, to generate a common understanding of the food system. We then looked at these food system actors and identified those that had the most influence on the sustainability behavior of other food system actors. And then identified basically the unsustainable behavior of those actors and the drivers behind, so to get an understanding of the key dynamics of the food system, the constraints that people face, and the drivers behind their behavior. We also looked then at enabling conditions towards behavior change, towards sustainability, and on this basis, on this collective knowledge that was put together, we identified, or the participants identified, the relevant building blocks that a legislative framework should cover. These were further developed, and then all the discussions were synthesized in a report that is publicly available and has been published beginning of this year. So this process was a pilot early on in the policymaking process. And we think it shows that the inclusive and participatory format of this engagement enables a systemic approach, which is needed if we want to talk about food systems. And it allows a broader range of views to be included in an interactive way in the discussion. It enables a new quality of the discussions at this stage in the policy process. It is an open discussion. There's a room to develop and find common ground. It brings different actors in the food system together who bring in their different views, cross-sectoral and also cross-disciplinary. It allows making sense of the available evidence and the expertise, and allows to focus on horizontal issues, which then reflects and also underlines the systemic approach that is needed. It is, within its limitations, of course, it's a transparent process, which might increase the credibility of the output and also the acceptance of the result. And if we look at this from a JRC perspective, so from the point of view of scientific policy support, so this allows an early engagement in the policy development process and gives the potential to have another look at the policy problem, to jointly unpack and possibly reframe policy issue, and to look at things from a different perspective. And actually the JRC is now continuing this, this pilot. We are involved now in the impact assessment of this legislative framework. And also this continues to be a pilot exercise, actually, as it requires us now to integrate the relevant knowledge, the in-house expertise that is needed to be able to carry out this impact assessment in a systemic way. And again, this shows that the complexity of sustainability of the food system, so the challenges that we face, they need also to be reflected in the way we approach these tasks to be able to advance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Anne-Katrin. Please take a seat. While we call for our final flash talk of the first part of the session, and it's Dr. Marc Kuchner, Citizen Science Officer for NASA. Marc, are you with us?
Right here, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi Marc, happy to have you here. So I'm very proud to present Marc, who has been, who's looking after 28 NASA citizen science projects that connect more than 2 million volunteer scientists around the world. And he invented the band-limited mask used on the Jason Webb telescope, for example. So Marc, so happy to have you here. The floor is yours. He will talk to us about reaching volunteers for evidence, lessons from citizen science. Marc, please.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'm really heartened to hear the international interest in open science that the last speakers were talking about, because it really underpins what we're doing at NASA with citizen science by making the tools and the data accessible to the public. we're able to do some amazing things. And thanks for this opportunity to brag about it. At NASA, we have 28 now active citizen science projects. We just launched the most recent one yesterday. It's a project to find storms in Jupiter's atmosphere. The projects span all sorts of different science. Some of the ones that would interest you folks, we have a really cool one called Globe Observer. Land cover use changes in land cover use, of course, so important in seeding pandemics, so we want to keep track of those. I think the big change that is taking place, the big shift that's been taking place, is that we used to say that citizen science is accomplishing real science. And now we say that citizen science is dominating multiple scientific fields. So NASA citizen scientists have discovered most of the known comets. There's no qualifier on that, that's why I'm pausing. There's most of the known comets. All of the known samples of interstellar material that we have in the lab were discovered by NASA citizen scientists, half of the ultra-cooled brown dwarfs, a third of Kepler's long-period extrasolar planets. So we're really coming to rely on the massive intellectual resource that's available when you work with citizen scientists. I mentioned the Globe Observer land cover project. We're saving lives in other ways with citizen science projects. Landslide Reporter is building an open database of landslides. Globe Mosquito Habitat Mapper is studying how mosquitoes are spreading and carrying diseases. NASA citizen scientists have discovered, I'm going to read this, I'm going to do it. The TP10 special signature for lightning at 15 to 30 megahertz. The star-forming region is called yellow balls, a rare six-plant transiting system. The first extreme P subdwarf, Zika virus, and Peruvian cemetery bases, the oldest white dwarf debris disk typical star phenomenon, the Peter Pan disk phenomenon, exocampus Kepler data, the Meyer family of comets, transiting planet in Kepler star system, 400,000 Martian seasonal fans, 283,000 emperor penguin nests, 9,120 candidate near-Earth asteroids, 8,900 mosquito breeding sites, and they got rid of the mosquitoes by dumping out the water. 7 meteorites, 1 new kind of aurora named Steve, and there's a picture of the stamp in Canada, sorry, the coin in Canada that has a picture of this new kind of aurora on it. We reach more than 2 million volunteers, and when I talk about this resource, this talent resource, we know if you just take the fraction of people who have advanced degrees, it's about 6% of the country has advanced degrees, and you multiply it by 2 million, you get 140,000 people with advanced degrees. But we also know from surveys that citizen science tends to attract people with more education, more training, so the number is probably higher than that. It's about a sixth at minimum of the total science and engineering workforce in the United States. So these talented folks have published at this point, they've co-authored more than 227 refereed published papers since I've been keeping track. Anyway, I could go on and on, but here are the takeaway points. Citizen scientists are smart. They're a wonderful resource for helping solve the problems that we've been thinking about today. And if you don't reach out to them and find a way to harness their intellect, you may be missing a big opportunity to help you advance your goals at saving the world. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Marc. And while I'm kindly asking the technicians to give us all the speakers on the screen, and I join Anne-Katrin here in this very comfortable chair, my colleagues will be launching a poll for you in our app. So if you have the app downloaded, we have a bit of a poll. So we leave you to it. The poll will be launched soon. I see we have John, Anna, and Marc connected, and Anne-Katrin here. So maybe I start with the question for Anna, because Anna, we got a question from the chat. Publication quality is already a growing problem in science. How do you protect the scientific community from fake science, fake journals and platforms that don't have quality control?
Well, one thing that we always say with open science, because it is open and because the idea is that it's transparent and that it also presents the data underpinning the research in a transparent way, that actually increases the quality of science because the scrutiny is bigger Then some of the other methods that can be, without necessarily right away having access to also the underpinning data and metadata which were used to produce those conclusions. So in a way, the way we see it is that open science really does increase the quality of open science because it increases the scrutiny procedures also related to open science. What we do see with open science, but not only with open science, are these possible predatory journals where the quality is low. But we have more and more insights into what those journals are and how to distinguish them. And we have more and more ways of really avoiding these types of journals and really concentrating on high quality journals, which don't necessarily always, which are also open access more and more. So from the perspective of the recommendation and also the consultations that we've held, the general feeling is that open science actually can really increase the quality of science rather than be a threat to it in any way.
Thanks for that, Anna. I like the fact that you are an optimist, as I think many of us are in the room, who are really open science and social science enthusiasts. Anne-Katrin, I found your talk very interesting because I think the whole engagement process of different stakeholders in all of this process linked to the Green Deal and the farm to fork process are quite interesting. A question for you, it's not an easy one. What do you think is the impact of the consultations with stakeholders? Let's maybe look at it both from the resulting policies point of view, maybe quality, but also on the trust in the process. Thanks. And I think you need to...
I think, first of all, I wouldn't call it consultation because...
Can you hear?
I think
okay,
so.
Good.
It works, yeah. Because consultation is a term that is often used in EU policymaking, and it's a very standard format of gathering opinions, basically. And what we're trying to do is a more interactive way, which I think brings benefits to both sides. So the policymakers have a different access and a way of interaction with stakeholders, so that could increase also an understanding, or a different kind, could generate a different kind of understanding, and vice versa, because policymaking is a tough job, and I think for many that is not really clear. And we had one example, so we have a game where you can play through different scenarios and you take different roles, and there were people taking the policymaker role, and their reaction was, oh, I didn't really know that it's really so difficult to be a policymaker and to make these kinds of decisions. If I look at it with a foresight perspective, so these kind of approaches, different processes, give you the possibility also to generate common ground, to generate a common vision, which then helps you, of course, in developing policies, because you generate a certain buy-in. And you mentioned trust. I think this is also a part of that. And also with the idea, so we're all human beings, and so to getting to know each other a bit better on that level as well, I think also helps in the process. So this is not some strange people who do policies somewhere on an island, but we're all in the same boat.
Thanks for that. It's actually linked. If you didn't have the chance this morning, we had a discussion in the session on advancing ecosystem in food safety, and we discussed just about this, just getting to know people and being part of a single discussion at times is a big step already. Marc, I have a question for you. So we know you're passionate also about science communication, and you've written a book on marketing for scientists. So in your opinion, what is the best way to market citizen science to maximize participation?
Oh, that's a great question. I know that we get a really good response from emails. Email marketing is extremely effective. You know, marketing is an experiment. You know, you try a lot of different things, and they reach different groups of people. You know, we're also proud that we work, for example, with folks in remote communities in Alaska to help us do science there on climate and on how ice is evolving in Alaska, and that requires a different marketing approach to reach those communities to bring that data together. So it's an experiment.
Thanks, Mark. And we also have a question, since I have you online. We have a question, what is the strategy to validate, and if it's a systematic validation of data collected from citizens?
Oh, validation of data collected from citizens.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think the best way to do it is to do it. So before our projects launch, they're always required by NASA policy to beta test, to start the project using a smaller group of volunteers before it's announced to the public. And you collect the data. You have the volunteers do the work, and you see if the data quality works. And if it's not answering the questions the way that you're hoping for, then you tweak the project, or you train the volunteers, or you do something different.
Thanks.
Another popular method is redundancy. Having people check and double check their projects that have multiple layers of volunteers checking other volunteers before it gets into publication, of course.
Great. Now a question that's very close to my heart. So for John. John, I mean, you talked about COVID and the fact how COVID brought behavioral insights. If there was ever a doubt, do you think COVID was an eye-opener for regulatory bodies to make sure that the behavioral insights are an integral part of their work? And what do you think us social scientists need to do not to lose the momentum?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, and I think I would say that if there was ever doubt in anyone's mind that social sciences are needed in pandemic response or in the response to any outbreak, COVID provided every piece of evidence, because obviously all of the scientific expertise. When I'm talking about scientific expertise, I'm talking about understanding the virus, understanding the immunology, understanding the epidemiology and clinical outcomes. Obviously, that's absolutely critical, but everything about this is behaviorally driven. And if we don't understand the behaviors, and we don't understand the social context and cultural context in which those behaviors are taking place, then all of our strategies are going to be misaimed and mistimed. So I think the penny has really dropped. Obviously, it's not the first time that there has been a recognition of the importance of behavioral and social sciences. I mean, any infectious disease has this element to it, or indeed many non-communicable diseases also have a behavioral component. We had a lot of experience gained through the HIV pandemic earlier on, with the gay community providing an incredible amount of insights into how to engage with communities. And actually, this is quite related, interestingly, to the whole question of citizen scientists, because essentially what we're talking about here is partnership with the people who are actually enduring the disease. And HIV was a very, very good example of that, especially with the gay communities, where they really took the lead in understanding what needed to be done to prevent and to facilitate and ensure good adherence to treatment and so on. And similarly with COVID, whether it's to do with homeless people, how do you tell homeless people to stay home? Or whether it's to do with migrants who can't access vaccination because they don't have the papers that register them in the country, and therefore they don't have the numbers to allow them into the clinics and so on. By speaking with these people and by engaging with these people, by actively having partnership with them, you help solve the problem. So I think if we're looking at paradigm shift, this is very much in the same bowl as citizen science. It's about partnership, it's about understanding the people you're working with. And COVID has surely provided us with evidence of that. My real worry is that we may be losing the focus on that. Everybody's so completely fed up with COVID. We're moving on to other things. We now have monkeypox. We have this awful outbreak of hepatitis of unknown origin in small children, for example. So the sort of global focus is moving from COVID to other diseases. But we're still having thousands of people dying from COVID every week. So this thing is not by any stretch gone away. So I'm just hoping that we can keep the thing boiling, and keep people focusing on the importance of engaging with communities and the importance of collecting this critical social and behavioral data, which will help to enable good policies and good strategies to control the outbreak.
Thanks, John. I'm sorry we don't have much more time because we need to continue with the session, but we did launch a poll. We have a bit of a technical problem in showing you the results, but I will be happy to tell you about the results. So we asked people which of the following challenges for involving society in science are most concerning or concern you most. The amount of time and resources needed, the quality of the input, or the policy buy-in. And what people voted most was the amount and time of resources needed, meaning that involving society in science is a bit of a time-consuming and resource-consuming process from an organizational point of view. May I ask you for a 30-second comment each on that? Anna, we start with you. We can hear you
sorry,
now.
I had a little, a connection problem here. Can you just very briefly, because I couldn't hear the...
Yeah, we were talking about the poll. We launched a poll to ask people about the challenges, and the challenge that won was that it's time and resource consuming to involve society in science. So I wanted to have a 30-second reaction from each of you from an organizational point of view on that.
A 30-second reaction is very difficult. Again, I think that the impact is bigger. So if you have a bigger impact, then I think those maybe 15 minutes extra that you have to dedicate, or even more extra, is definitely worth it.
Thank you. Anne-Katrin.
Well, I think I can only confirm that it does take time. So we tailor our processes, we design them. It's quite an amount of work, but it's well spent time. So the engagement is fruitful. It gives a different quality of results. So yeah, if you want to spend your time on something, do that.
Great. John?
I would say, yes, of course, it does take time. It does take effort, and everybody's got their own busy lives to take care of. But people fundamentally do want to engage in the decisions that affect their lives. And if they personally can't do it, there are all sorts of civil society organizations that are engaged. And if you can't necessarily identify the gatekeeper within a particular community, identify the religious leaders or the civil society organizations who represent it, there definitely is a role for these people, and they should be engaged to help formulate and shape policies and decisions.
Thank you. Marc, we close with you.
You know, I often compare working with volunteers to working with interns. We're all accustomed to training students and interns, and sometimes you spend a lot of time on people and it doesn't work out, but sometimes you get a star who changes your whole life. And I kind of view citizen science and open science in that manner. It's a risk, but sometimes it pays off big, and it's really inclusive, which is what we're all thinking about these days.
Thank you, and I think inclusiveness and diversity was one of the keywords of yesterday's opening session as well, and today. So thank you guys for being part of us on this journey and preparing this session, and thank you so much for this mini panel, and we'll move on to the next part. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, second part, new part. On the second part, we'll be talking about communication in the digital age, and we'll be focusing a bit more on the communication aspect, which is let's say, the traditional way of where you want to talk when you talk about social science and risk analysis. So I've heard some complaints that we had too many natural scientists in the first part, so that's why I'm really happy to introduce well, the next speaker doesn't really need much introduction, especially if you are for science or risk communication. Professor Sander van der Linden, Professor of Social Psychology in Society and Director of the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Lab in the Department of Psychology. He is ranked among the top 1% social scientists in the world by number of citations, and his work is regularly covered by outlets such as the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and the BBC. Sander, you'll talk to us about risk communication in a digital age, keeping up with the trends. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? Everything working? Technology-wise, perfect, yeah. I thought I'd share some lessons with with everyone on how we've tackled communicating risk in the digital age. And I'll show you a range of examples across different sort of risk communication issues. But one of the first things we did during the pandemic was to try to see what the role is of people's risk perception in terms of whether or not they wanted to get the vaccination. This was before, before the first vaccines came out. And this is a correlation plot here. It's not too important. These are odds ratios. And we did the survey in Spain, France, the UK, Mexico, so a lot of different places and repeatedly. What I just wanted to point out is that if you look at the very bottom, perceived infection risk and people's worry about COVID were clearly two important factors in correlating with people's decision to get vaccinated. But then the question arises in terms of, okay, well, what makes up people's perception of risk? And we know that there's a huge literature on that. And what we tried to do at the start of the pandemic was try to map the dimensions that were predictive of how people were perceiving the risk of COVID. And again, I'm showing you from similar surveys. These are all national surveys we've done. This is the map of where we did the surveys. These are the means and the distributions of people's risk perception in the average in the UK, Spain, the US, Germany, Sweden, Australia, Japan, Italy, Mexico, so really all over the world. And generally people were concerned about COVID. But if you look at some of the most important predictors by country and on the aggregate, it's really interesting. So you see things like worldviews, the extent to which people prioritize the role of government in society, so particularly people who feel that the role of government should be minimal, were much lower on the risk perception. People are very pro-social, were much higher on the risk perception. Experience with the virus, trust in the medical community, trust in science, those were all important factors throughout. What's interesting, though, is if you look at actual confirmed number of cases, those were not very predictive in terms of looking at people's risk perception. And so a lot of how people actually perceive and construe the risk, and this is the first lesson that I want to get to, is actually not related to some of the objective factors that we see here. And we know this from other research in the context of climate change, where the actual environmental change doesn't seem to impact people's risk perceptions very much. It's much more about how people subjectively perceive the risk. But I think one of the first lessons that occurred to me, especially in the digital age now, is that 90% of research on risk communication is static. So we tend to think of risk as something that people perceive, and we measure it at one point in time, and that's it. But actually, it's a dynamic construct. So we've been tracking people's risk perception of COVID longitudinally as well. And so you can see here that it goes up and down depending on what goes on. It actually doesn't correlate with the number of cases, if people are wondering about that. You would expect it to, but it doesn't really. And so I think risk perception is not always a very stable property. It responds to media events, and it can be quite unstable with regards to what people read, hear, and see from other people. And so some of the variables that I showed you earlier, social amplification, people's perception of risk is shaped by what they hear on the news and the media, on Twitter, social media in particular. And one of the things that I'm very interested in particularly is how risk perception is shaped by misinformation. And so here you can see actually also an interaction plot of the relationship between risk and people's inclination to engage in protective health behaviors. These are the number of behaviors people would adopt. And this relationship also shifted over the course of the pandemic. So, the relationship between perception of risk and behaviors also dynamically shifting in response to information. And I think one of the big threats here is, I just noticed that my slides are stacked, so there's animation, but I don't think that works because I'm not kind of clicking through it, but we'll see in just a second. There was a great paper that talks about how misinformation is kind of a meta risk in that it alters people's perception of the risk, and so you get all of these confounded problems. That there are problems with what exactly is scientific misinformation in terms of defining it, but also we have COVID risk definition problems, uncertainty about the risks, trustworthiness of the communicators. And so what they were trying to say is that the presence of misinformation confounds our understanding of risk and actually distorts people's perception of risk greatly. There are some examples. I don't think it's showing because the animation's not coming up. I might just have to talk you through rather than showing the slides, because my slides tend to have stacked animation, and this appears to just give you the kind of the final slide. But the example I wanted to give you, somebody in the session earlier mentioned HIV. There was a huge case in the UK here where there was misinformation that went viral on WhatsApp claiming that a worker in a supermarket had infected chips or crisps, as they say here, with his blood, and he had HIV, and so we should all be scared of buying this particular brand of candy because it has HIV infected blood. I mean, this was total fake news, but it nonetheless caused a big scare amongst people's inclination to buy the product, particularly because their perception of risk was distorted by what they saw on the news. Right, this is not showing up. Another example from Twitter. A MEP, member of the European Parliament, tweeted something about how some expert on the BBC said something about how we still need to, engage in protective health behaviors, even though we now have vaccinations. And they were kind of making fun of this expert. And I can't show you it here, but the expert was me, actually. It's interesting because what they essentially were saying was that people can't deal with uncertainty. And again, I'm sorry, the slides are not popping up here, but the issue, especially during the pandemic, was this sort of mantra of we're following the science and stick to the science. And what you see, especially online, is that when science gets politicized, it really affects people's understanding of the risk in very differential ways. And the relevance of the quote here was actually that they were trying to say that if you're too honest with people about that the vaccine's useful, but it's not going to solve everything, that people are then not going to adopt, behavior changes and not going to get the vaccine because what does it matter anyway? And there's this underlying tendency that we don't want to communicate uncertainty because people don't understand it and they're going to be hesitant. And Honora O'Neill, which you can see here, is a philosopher in the UK, has this really interesting concept about trust, that everyone talks about the decline of trust and the crisis of trust in communication, but she wonders about what we actually mean with trust. And one of the interesting questions that she poses is, well, who do you trust to do what exactly? And so a lot of the public opinion polls are not really specific about why we would trust someone to do a particular thing. And so it's a really interesting question. And I think ultimately it's about displaying trustworthy behavior as organizations, as individuals, as medical professionals, as scientists. We need to display trustworthy behavior in order for people to trust what we're saying. And so we came up with 5 rules for risk and evidence communication in the digital age that we think is particularly important. Considering people bombarded with information, this idea of just being transparent is not an easy solution in itself, because just bombarding people with information, both true and false, which is also known as the infodemic, is not necessarily helping people. But we do need some guidance as to what it is that we should focus on. And in the remainder of my talk, I just want to talk about 2 points, 2 of the 5 rules, and one is about uncertainty in particular. And so we have this sort of contrast between informing and persuading people, and we just heard about marketing. What I'm going to talk about now is actually one of the rules is to inform people, not persuade them, to offer balance, but not false balance, as we've seen on issues like climate, but also disclose uncertainties and inoculate against misinformation, which means to preempt misunderstandings that people might have when they could, for example, weaponize uncertainty. But explaining uncertainty, I think, is really key to the current audience and to understanding risk in the digital age. Again, there's something you can't see on this slide, but basically, an article in Science Advances argued that uncertainty is all good and well, but in fact, people will lose confidence, they will lose trust in the message if you openly talk about the uncertainty in scientific models, the uncertainty in what we know about solutions, and so on. And so we wanted to test this systematically to see if this is true. And what we can do to communicate uncertainty in a useful way, and that's what I'll spend the last 5 minutes talking about. Here's the tweet actually talking about risk in a digital age. Somebody was responding directly to this claim that I had about being transparent about evidence and saying, oh, if you're transparent about science, this will fuel anti-vax conspiracies. So let's have a look. One of my postdocs and a team here at Cambridge, we did a number of studies on communicating uncertainty, and I'll show you some of that evidence now. Now, a lot of the stuff that is misinformation isn't intentional. Take the BBC, right, which is a super credible outlet. They say that UK unemployment fell by 3,000 to 1.44 million. This was a news article in 2018. If you look at the methodology, actually, and you look at the confidence interval, it was 3,000 plus or minus 77,000. So in reality, the correct answer here would be you can't say anything about whether unemployment went up or down, and just saying it fell by 3,000 could be construed as misleading, even misinformation, if you just define that as information that's not entirely correct. And so what we wanted to do is investigate whether fixing these type of problems with better communication erodes public trust, because that's everyone's concern. So we did a study online with about 1,000 people. We had a simple design. We told people about 3 different topics, whether it was climate, unemployment, or the number of tigers left in India, which is an estimation problem in conservation science. And then the type of uncertainty communication. Either we had no uncertainty, a numeric range, or a verbal qualifier of uncertainty. So what does that look like? So for unemployment, we told people, well, this is the number, but this could be the minimum, this could be the maximum, kind of simulating the idea of a confidence interval. And for verbal, it would say, oh, there's some uncertainty around the estimate. It could be somewhat higher or lower. And we did the same for the number of tigers and the same for climate science about the estimated rise in the global surface temperature. And then we asked people, do you think this number that you're seeing is certain or uncertain? Do you think it's reliable? Do you think the people who are writing this report are trustworthy? And what we find is that, yeah, people pick up on the fact that there's uncertainty. They notice it, especially when it's verbal. They don't tend to think that it's less reliable if the uncertainty is quantified and numeric, a little bit if it's verbal. And they don't think that the communicator is any less trustworthy unless it's verbal. Now, we've done a number of different experiments in that paper, and we always find the same thing, basically, that if you're specific and you're communicating uncertainty in numeric terms, it doesn't affect people's trust. It doesn't seem to affect whether people trust the number or whether they trust the communicator. I mean, in some way, you can say that's legitimate for people to trust the number a bit less because there's now more variability around it, which is the truth. But you don't want them to trust the communicator less because you're being more transparent amongst all the data and uncertainty that's out there, right? And so that's kind of what we found, except for verbal uncertainty, which kind of makes sense. People have aversion to ambiguity. If you tell people it's uncertain, could be higher or lower, right? People don't like verbal uncertainty, but they seem to be fine with numerical uncertainty. Now, talking about risk perception in the digital age, we wanted to actually innovate the way we test these sort of things. So that was in the lab. So what I'm showing you here is a collaboration with the BBC. So we told the BBC, look, you have this problem with not communicating uncertainty. Can we just run a news article worldwide and show half the people on their BBC News website a number, and the other half the number with the numeric range, and another group a verbal indicator of uncertainty. So BBC actually agreed, and they randomized audiences to the BBC website, one of 3 different versions of the same news article. And so you can see the uncertainty range here. And actually what we found digitally is that people did perceive the uncertainty. They didn't have any less trust in the number, and they didn't trust the source any less. And so, here's this idea that, when it's specific and relevant, you can communicate uncertainty to people without losing trust. And we've started to systematically uncover some of these principles in more detail. So, for example, we've tried to create messages. So we take a standard communication, let's say again about COVID. This is from the NHS website about the vaccine. So we take the standard message, and then we tested according to one of our rules of evidence communication. So we take the message and then we adapt it. You can see here our track changes. We include the uncertainty around risks and benefits of the vaccine. We include the quality of the underlying evidence. We include the idea that we want to pre-bunk potential misunderstandings, for example, why the vaccine was approved so early, and things like that. And then we test it and see how people respond to it. So this was at the time when people were not vaccinated yet, so we had about a representative sample of unvaccinated people. And again, exposed to our new message versus the standard, people didn't trust it any less. They didn't think the producer was any less trustworthy. And in fact, the people who were, this is an interaction, the people who were most hesitant about the vaccine actually trusted our information more than the standard message, presumably because it gives a more transparent and honest overview of the evidence. And we repeated this in the context of nuclear power, and the same type of experiment, and basically the same findings. People, when they look at the evidence, they say, yeah, this transparent communication message is more balanced. It's less persuasion. It's more information. It addressed misunderstandings. It acknowledges the quality of the evidence. There was more uncertainty, and people agreed that we talked about risks and benefits. And again, you see people trusted more in this case. And reactance is a concept that people react to the message in a negative way because they feel you're restricting their freedom by trying to persuade them with a one-sided kind of message. So we found that people were lower on reactance. But there was an interesting side effect. People were less supportive of nuclear policy when they saw one of our messages. But at the end of the day, we didn't have a baseline control, so we don't actually know whether it lowered the message, whether it lowered support. But I think at the end of the day, the point is that if you're honest with people, there could be an effect that people now take a different policy position because you've been more transparent. So to sort of sum up, risk perception can be highly dynamic. I think it's very reactive to what's happening on social media, in the mainstream media, much more so than before. There's this huge threat of misinformation distorting people's risk perception on social media. And so one of the solutions is to offer trustworthy communications. And the way to do that is to emphasize some of the rules about risk communication that I think I've highlighted here, that I hope will help people discern, especially now in the digital age, what's reliable and what's not reliable. So thanks for your attention. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Sander. We'll have a dedicated Q&A session because we're following the same format as we did before. So now we're going to give you 3 flash talks because the 3 things we wanted to highlight today were, 1, designing information in appealing and different ways, using new technologies for social research, and 3rd, a private sector perspective on communicating in an era of sustainability. So our first speaker was supposed to be Federica Fragapane, a very successful information designer who has collaborated with the United Nations, La Lettura, Il Corriere, and many other journals. Unfortunately, she cannot be with us today, but she left a beautiful pre-recorded speech. So if I can ask the technicians to give us Federica's short video, after which we will move to the next speaker. Thank you so much. And Federica, I'm sure you will love her video and learn a lot about her work also afterwards. Please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Federica Fragapane, and I'm an information designer. I work as a freelancer designing visualizations, data visualizations for magazines and organizations. In the last years, I worked for the United Nations, La Lettura, Scientific American, Google, and BBC Science Focus. And this is what I do. I visually translate number, contents, and stories to allow readers to explore them. And the range of complexity that characterizes my projects can be broad according to the needs, the readers, and the usage context. And I'm going to show you a few examples and also the process and the reasons behind them. I want to show you a first example. I collaborate with La Lettura, that is the cultural supplement of the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. I designed data visualizations for their visualization column called Visual Data. And I always have to mention La Lettura's usage context. Those are the pictures shared by La Lettura's readers. So a picture with La Lettura next to a cup of coffee or a tea in a context that suggests as the reading act is part of a lazy and relaxing Sunday morning. So reading La Lettura is a slow process, and having in mind the usage context has a strong influence on my design approach to the project. I know that I can work on pieces that need more time to be read. And this is the usual design process. So at first I select the topics and sources. I often propose the topics. Then I work on the data analysis. And finally, I design a custom visualization. I want to show you an example. Some years ago, I visualized some data about the CO2 emissions for a set of countries. And this was the data set I started from. I have the data on the CO2 emissions for a list of countries through a selection of years. And after having analyzed the data, I always spend a lot of time looking for visual inspiration. I really try to fill my eyes and my minds with images that can inspire me. And the goal is to create new visual languages. And the final goal is always to engage the readers, to catch their attention, and to experiment with shapes in order to reach such a goal. And after having analyzed the data and having looked for inspiration, I moved to the following phase, that is defining a set of rules that I'm going to apply to my variables, my countries in this case. And so in this case, I decided that I wanted to visualize a set of years for the countries that I selected from 1992 to 2012. And as you can see, each radio here represents a year. And then for each year, I represented the CO2 emissions inspired by the image that I previously shown. And here the emissions are represented by those petals whose length shows the tons of CO2 in thousands. And I really think that working in detail on the textures, on the overall look and feel, when the usage context allows it, can really help me in creating something that can attract readers' attention. And then I usually overlay different layers of information in this kind of projects to give the readers the possibility of reading the topic I'm talking about with different deepnesses of analysis. So here I added as another layer of information the color that shows the change in the emissions over the previous year, red for increased emissions and blue for decreased ones. It's not a new data, it's something that you can already see looking at the shapes, but it's really a visual guide to help the readers in further looking at the insights. And finally, I added a new data, on the renewable energy consumption. And this is the final piece, in which, as you can see, I applied all my rules to the countries that I had selected. There are some elements that can quickly be seen, such as the size of certain countries or the predominance of a certain color, and keeping this possibility is important. But there are also elements that need time to be read in a kind of slow reading connection between the readers and the visualization. I don't think it's a problem. I think that the data visualization field can offer a very wide range of possible projects to explore. And I think that when the usage context allows it, it's also the right thing talking about complex topics without oversimplifying them, giving the readers the possibility of reading them, taking the proper time to do it. As you can see in the top right corner, there is a legend that explains how to read the visualization. And for me, creating a legend is essential because it's really the bridge between me and the readers, and I dedicate a lot of time to the visual explanation of the project. For me, creating this visualization is really like writing with visual alphabets, and I dedicate a lot of time to choosing the proper visual words. I really think that the words that we are going to choose has an important role in communicating stories, and I wanted to show you another example. Some time ago, I worked on a visual representation of the menstrual cycle for Scientific American. And besides all the documents I needed to visualize it, the Scientific Americans teams also sent me an extremely interesting paper mentioning the cultural practices surrounding menstruation and the taboos that still surround the topic. And reading that paper meaningfully influenced my design approach to the project. I wanted to design an informative and beautiful piece, and in this case, I particularly focus on the role of beauty and aesthetics in contrast with the stigma still associated with menstruations. And this is the final piece, in which I represented the menstrual cycle, showing the variables involved and their connections. So for me, working on these visual translations, it's really a way to invite the readers in looking at my data, the contents that I'm showing and representing. Sometimes data and numbers can be intimidating for readers. Some years ago, I worked on BBC Science Focus visualizing space debris, the topic of space debris, and those were the data, and this is the final project in which I visualize the space debris, categorizing them by type of object and by distance from Earth. So this for me is the main goal of my representations, communicating to people, engaging them, and therefore inviting them to read my stories and the contents that I'm showing and representing. Thank you so much for your attention. Bye.
Wow, I find always these data visualization presentations quite impressive, and always start thinking about all the things we could do at EFSA and with different scientific opinions, visualizing them in different ways. So I thank Federica, who actually tried even to make for the Q&A, but really had another commitment today, but we'll have chances to collaborate with her more. Okay, now, we didn't have a social science method hashtag for quite a while since John. So my next speaker, a friend, a colleague, it makes me really happy to present Michelle Patel, the Deputy Director of Analysis and Insight with the science team at the Food Standards Agency in the UK. She has 20 years in experience in the government and background in comms, and she remains an endlessly curious scholar of public attitudes and behaviors. Michelle, the floor is yours. I will give you the clicker that I selflessly had.
That's okay, I have one slide.
So the technicians, please. Michelle, the floor is yours.
So I'm very glad I have one slide because I cannot compete with that previous presentation. That was so beautiful. Thank you very much, EFSA. Thank you, Doma, for having me. I'd like to talk about how we communicate and engage with people using digital means at the FSA. If I click it, I want to talk about why and how we use digital social research methods to connect us to consumers and citizens. But can you hear me all right? Now you can. Oh, I'm sorry. I move around a lot. I want to talk about this, but I want to frame it in a couple of things that we've been hearing over the past couple of days. So the first thing that I heard yesterday was some really great stuff around participation and why it's important, and about epistemic engagement. And I think, you know, we hear a lot about this. I want to talk about how we do it in real life in a regulator and some of the tensions that we encounter, but also some of the ways that you can use digital tools to do more, get closer, get quicker, get more effective, get more meaningful engagement from consumers. And we do this for three reasons. Firstly, we do it for a normative reason. We do it because we want to find out what people want us to do. We're regulators, we are scientists, but we provide regulatory analysis to serve the public interest. That's really different from public opinion. I just want to put that one out there. It's not that we want to do public opinion research. We want to understand what are the values, the mores, the aspirations, the behaviors, the attitudes of the consumers that we serve. We do it for epistemic reasons. We do it to find out things we don't know. And we do it for instrumental reasons. We do it either cynically or earnestly to legitimize some of the decisions that we're taking, having made them be and seen to be made in the public interest. So it was really great to kind of hear some of those thoughts yesterday and to feel like I'm building on that. And I'm going to do a canter through 6 digital methods that we're using right now, to get closer and quicker in terms of doing the engagement, because I think there was a question that came up at the last panel about how this was time-consuming and expensive. Well, yes, it is time-consuming and expensive. It's also quite important. In fact, it's central to the legitimacy of an organisation like mine. So I'm not going to I'm not going to kind of apologize for it being time-consuming. I'm not going to apologize where it needs to be for it to being expensive. Science is time-consuming and expensive. And as far as we're concerned, there are sort of three things we worry about. There's what's on food, there's what's in food, and there's what people are going to do about it. And you can't do that third thing without really understanding where people are coming from. So it's worth being time-consuming and expensive, but it doesn't have to be. So my slides are not beautiful, but hopefully they are useful. In the short links here, you will find links to a very recent or current piece of research that we've published. It will have the technical guidance, it will have the methodologies, so I'm not going to go into huge detail about each of them, but I'm going to try and frame each one in what it does for us. So the first one I'm going to talk about is our rapid survey platform. We can get simple answers to simple questions from a representative sample of UK consumers. I think my record is 17 hours and 54 minutes, but don't test me on that. It isn't very complicated. It is only really something you can do as a bit of a blunt instrument, but when you are trying to communicate risk in a crisis, it is invaluable to have really good evidence that fast. And so we developed this for when we knew we might need it. The second thing, if you move across though, does start to become more sophisticated. There's a tool called Polis that we use sometimes, and we used it recently in a piece of work we did called Food in the Pandemic, to really understand and help co-create with citizens social attitudes towards, at the time, community food provision in a pandemic. So what happens there is you put a statement, an attitudinal statement. I believe that school meals should be free, for example, out there, and then citizens, in their thousands, are invited to tweak the statement to make it more in concord with what they actually think and feel and believe. You also can gather then demographic data from them, and that gives you a really good map, not only of where people actually are framed by their own contributions, but also who's where. And some of the things we found in that study are particularly interesting around social attitudes to food provision. You can get a little bit closer to people if you use digital tools. So one of the pieces of work we've just published is a piece of online ethnography around hand washing in a pandemic. Who knew? We've been talking about hand washing for decades. Who knew hand washing was going to be the sexy thing that it was? And actually, it's really fascinating. If you get people to use their own tools, their own language, their own context, their own way of framing it, and get really rich data, just using their own mobile phone around when they wash their hands, what they're thinking when they're doing it, how they remembered they were going to do it, how the mnemonics work around doing it for 20 seconds, and then interview their friends and colleagues and families. And, you know, if everyone's stuck inside and really bored, that helps. But, you know, we got a really rich piece of work, a really rich understanding of how this very simple behavior isn't actually that simple, and what we but it is life-saving, so what we can do then to encourage more of it. But these are relatively small projects, and none of what we were doing really to move a lot of our work to digital was driven by the pandemic. It's just very fortunate that it was all online by the time the pandemic hit. So we've been running deliberative work throughout the pandemic online. I know that's hard, right? Deliberative work anyway is hard. It's complicated, it's important, it's how you get an equitable dialogue with citizens around complex system issues. And it's an area of great interest for me. And we were doing it on, you know, perhaps the hottest topic of all, genome editing, online during the pandemic with citizens. And it went quite well. We made sure it did, because we made sure that we had real good, equitable access to expertise, played it very, very straight in terms of presenting the messages, giving people time to discuss, time to engage with it, and allowing people to go through what we call, and we see this often in deliberative research, the deliberative dip, where actually the complexity of the situation, you know, almost has an emotional impact on participants, and then you come out the other side and you start to have much more reasoned discussions between experts and participants, which are more based in an informed decision around trustworthiness rather than the sort of slightly brittle, blind faith, perhaps, that people come in with at the start. And you can do that online. And in fact, what we've found is that if you do it well online, you might get access to groups of people who don't normally attend these sorts of town hall events. You get access to people who are working. You get access to people who are younger. You know, the profile of the people that come to the traditional deliberative forums, they are whiter, they are older, they are richer, they are more educated, but they are not helping you get to a representative group of the people that you really want to engage with. So perhaps there is a role for this going forward, and we're continuing to use those tools. And then we moved our flagship survey, Food and You, in 2019 onto a web push for those very same reasons, because we were really struggling to get the sort of conversion through face-to-face surveying that we used to get before. So we use web push, so it's not exclusively digital, but it's digital first. We'd already decided to do that before the pandemic, but I mean, there's silver linings to everything. We really got lucky. So we wanted a 5,000 sample. You always over push. We actually got a 10,000 sample because people didn't have very much else to do, and they were filling it in, and they were getting people in their house to fill it in. Now that'll level off, but what it's done, because of the efficiency of doing it that way, and of course, you know, we use a very robust sampling framework. You know, I'm confident in the representativeness of the sample that we have, but we can go to a bigger sample. We can overweight much more easily in Northern Ireland and Wales, so we can get a more representative view there. And we're running twice a year, not once every 2 years, which makes a huge difference to the usefulness of the data. It makes a lot of work, but again, you know, I'm not going to make any apologies for that. And it means that we can have a modular and flexible and responsive survey that can actually give us valuable data and evidence to move policy forward in real time, which we really couldn't before. We were just taking snapshots every 2 years of behaviours and attitudes. So where now? Well, at the moment, we're working on something really cool, and we've just published the literature review for it. It's called Kitchen Life 2. And this is an observed study. So we are using the whole gamut of the digital tools in our kind of playbook. So there is surveying, there is interviewing, but there's also cameras, there's sensors, there's in situ monitoring of people in their own kitchens, both domestic and commercial, with their consent. And we are picking up thousands, hundreds of thousands of data points that we're analysing with help of a little bit of machine learning, and that is filling in the evidence gaps in our risk assessment modelling. So there are a bunch of things in our modelling where we have to make an estimate based on a paper that was done in another country 20 years ago. We're now seeing whether that is what people really do. And we're also seeing things that people really do that nobody had any idea that people were doing. The amount of things that come in on your phone to your kitchen. Just think about how many times you touch your phone in your kitchen, just saying. So, you know, it's also giving us evidence for some potential behavioural interventions around things like that. So I'm mindful of time. I don't know how I'm doing, all right? So I'll pause there. I really, as somebody who's into participation, I really want questions. I'm going to sit down there in a minute, and I really do want to answer questions. I know I've galloped through. Each of these could be several PhDs. But I hope I've made a compelling case for bringing the understanding of citizen values and behaviours into food regulation. I think others have made it far more compellingly before me. I don't have to labour that. But I hope I've also made a compelling case for how new techniques can make it more possible and more accessible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, for that. Very interesting. Please take a seat. And we move to our last flash talk of the day. What I said, we wanted to include also a perspective of the private sector that offers a compelling sustainability narrative. So our last talk will be from Sudhanshu Sarronwala. He's the Chief Impact Officer of Infarm, the world's fastest growing urban farming network that specializes in vertical farming. His team works with governments, NGOs, companies, and other key partners to multiply the impact and create positive change in our society. Suds, that's how we call him, has spent more than 30 years in management, communication, and internet entrepreneurship. So Suds, the floor is yours. I hope you're connected. Yes, there you are. Please.
Thank you, Domagoj, and thank you, everybody. I'm hoping that I'll be able to handle the slides, but I'm not entirely sure how that works. Okay, so otherwise I'll ask you to help me move the slides along, if that's all right. Yeah, I can't seem to see the take control button anymore. It seems to have.
I think it's fine. You can start the talk, Suds, and we will do it from here.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so I would like to place this short talk into the context of climate change shocks, diminishing natural resources, and vulnerable supply chains. Climate change shocks, we've seen that through the IPCC reports and the role of agriculture and food production in terms of emissions. It's about a third of all emissions. Diminishing natural resources, again, IPBES reports, and the role of food production and agriculture on the degradation of land and ecosystems. And vulnerable supply chains, we've been talking a lot about COVID. We've seen how pandemics and then unfortunate conflicts can create supply havoc. So it's in this context that we're looking to effectively transform our food systems to reliably feed a growing urban population, which is going to be 7.2 billion by the time we're in 2050. The food equation, as you probably all know, as highlighted by Wageningen University, is as follows. We need to produce more food in the next 40 years than we've produced in the last 8,000. The aspects that render this equation unsolvable is the natural resource use, the emissions, waste, runoff, and long supply chains, amongst other reasons. So several of these are reflected in the planetary boundaries, as you probably know. And in short, we cannot produce food in the same way as we have done unless we had the resources of another planet Earth. And we don't, at least for now. So I represent Infarm, which is a vertical farming company. And I'm also acutely aware that we are the only food producer actually in the house at this powerful forum. So if somebody can help me just get to what was the second slide in my short deck of 4 or 5 slides, that would be great. Thank you. I'm not sure if it's there right now, but if you can see the slides, because I can't, you would see the farms. So each farm is about 10 meters high, that's the one, and on 40 square meters of space, floor space, and it produces the equivalent of about a football field worth of crops, with about 95% less land, water, and food miles. So it's about 500,000 crops a month coming out of this. And you can see the farmers or the in-farmers running around there in lab coats rather than in overalls. So this is sort of the face of farming as we see it. Now, controlled environment agriculture, which is the broader category, if you will, that we're talking about, and specifically vertical farming within that, play a huge role in helping to define the new agricultural revolution, which is needed if we're going to successfully feed 7.2 billion people without completely consuming the planet. So, of course, there are several other ag tech players in the space, whether it be protein substitutes, non-dairy alternatives, cultivated meats, and many more. So this entire ag tech revolution should be looked at in that context. Now, transforming any system, and more so something as massive as a $5 trillion food system, requires all of the visionary thinking and massive investment, et cetera, but it also requires the creation of a powerful narrative and a discourse that cuts across all of the different audiences that you're going to be working with, from consumers to partners to academia to the scientific community and all components of your supply chain, manufacturers, distributors, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what happens with a new industry or a nascent industry, for people to understand the product and the sustainable component of it, especially when it comes to the area that we're talking about in terms of food. So as we look to communicate with impact around solutions around sustainability, it was, of course, important to make sure that we're measuring everything in the right way and in a robust way. And taking that as a given, we're building the narrative across all of these audiences that we talk about, as well as for them to understand as to how can this form of farming have a positive impact from a production point of view as well as an ecosystem point of view. And the broader discourse is being built around these 4 elements that you can see here. which is around local production, land use, carbon and energy, and water. And we're working with, with obviously great science and scientific methods, because we are a tech outfit at the end of the day, to measure our impacts and to share it, not just with our close shareholders or stakeholders, but taking it much broader. And if we skip to the next slide, in terms of how we encapsulate all of this into something called an impact vision paper. Now, this is by itself, I mean, it's not really a plug for the vision paper, but it's really a underlining of our commitment to transparency about our own targets and the way that we see sustainability playing a role in the future of food production. And it's also there for everybody to hold our feet to the fire, because it's there for everybody to track, and it's been shared extensively across, society at large, if you will. We're also looking to take this to the next level in terms of traceability for all of the food that is produced, how it's produced, where it's produced, etc. More importantly, we think that it's crucial for the industry, and this is a relatively nascent industry, I would say a decade, sort of, in terms of vertical farming in a large commercial sense, to coalesce around specific standards, especially when it comes to sustainability and impact. And this paper also aims to facilitate or trigger some of that, because, and the most important point for us is that if you want systemic change to happen, it has to happen at an industry level. You could be the most successful and the most sustainable company in that sector, but if the rest of the industry does not follow some of those standards, you're not going to be able to create systemic change. And that for us is really important. And like Dhamal said, that's why we're working with scientific institutions like the Wageningen. That's why we're working with the NGOs, we're working with private sectors, we're working with multilateral agencies, etc. So in terms of getting people and setting standards, this becomes really important. So we're hoping that you can download and take, if you just flick the slide, if you could take a look at the paper on your own and challenge us with some questions, we would be very happy to talk about it and about the standards that we have chosen, and how we can communicate this better with the public, with all of the various audiences. And this is our first major step in further building and formalizing the narrative around sustainability and food production. Thank you.
Thank you, Suds. We're going to spend 10 minutes now in a short discussion. I will ask my friends and colleagues to launch another poll, which you can participate in the chat, which we will be discussing in the end. I've seen that we did have some questions in the chat. We will wait for the technicians to have Sander and Suds on the main screen. Maybe while we are waiting for that, Michelle, maybe I could start with you. Let's say you could make a wish for a technology that would allow certain insights into consumer behavior. What would that be?
I think, can you hear me? Yeah. I think the wish, it's not necessarily a technology unless you can kind of call it mind reading, which we're not quite there yet. But I think that the wish I would like to have is something that will really give us a read on that say-do gap, because we rely so heavily on surveying. And then when you look at observed data, you realize that people really don't know what it is they do or why they do it, even if they think they do, and they're telling you what they think you want to hear. And there's such a gap sometimes between people's self-perceptions. I'm not saying they're lying deliberately. Some may be. There may be social bias effects. There may be lots of reasons why we're not getting a real true read there. But I would love to have something that could give me the formula, should there be such a thing, to calculate what that say-do gap is. I would really love to hear people's inner thoughts, the ones they can't even hear themselves. That doesn't exist yet, but you said I could make a wish.
In fact, we had a question taking into account coordinated efforts to disrupt public opinion. How can we make web-based surveys work as a source of information on public opinion? which is quite an interesting one, and we often talk about this at EFSA also. Is there a social desirability bias? Are we really measuring the right thing? So this is an interesting one.
Yeah, I don't think I can tell you how. I think what they can do, if well tested cognitively and well developed, they can tell you what people think they're thinking and the diversity of that. And I think what's really important is if you can do it over time, you can see how those things are moving. So I saw some fantastic analysis. It was actually a discourse analysis where they traced public outrage and stories around public outrage, and then they did it on social media and listening as well, over the years, and you could see that actually the stories changed, but the outrage remained the same and grew, and it had a little bit more to do with correlations that were around other things that were happening socially as well, and this was fascinating, around publishing policies and the switch from, press to clickbait, and the way that the media was fueling these opinion stories and how the sentiment was getting heightened and heightened every time. So I think, looking at how you can use these digital tools to mass process data to give you insights that you would never really have been able to do without that huge data perspective is one answer.
In fact, thanks. Sandra, we have a couple of questions for you. One is something I would also want to know, because I don't think there's an answer. It's whether people equally understand numerically and verbally expressed uncertainties.
Well, there happens to be quite a bit of research on that, and they don't always. No. So when you ask people, and we've done some of this research ourselves, when you ask people what range would you put on somewhat uncertain, you actually see that different people put different ranges on what that means. So for some people, somewhat uncertain means 20%, for other people it means 40%. And so only at the extremes, when you say extremely certain, most people are in the 90% range. But when you say fairly certain, some people say 50% probability, other people say 80% probability. And so verbal quantifiers are extremely imprecise. And that's why we don't typically recommend that people use them. In the BBC experiment that I showed you online, one of the things we found was that journalists tend to use the word around a lot to hedge uncertainty. They'll say, "Oh, around this number," or "around this sort of figure," but people don't actually pick up on it. So when you include the word around, people don't think it's more uncertain than when you don't have that word. So it's quite interesting. But then when you do make it very clear that it's uncertain in verbal terms, people do react to that a lot, because I think there's so much variability that it's quite unclear to people. So that's why we usually always recommend to include numerical uncertainty or clarify the verbal terms with numerical ranges, such as the IPCC has adopted in most recent reporting based on recommendations from the literature.
Thanks. And there was also a question on distrust observed in the COVID-19 phenomenon, which you talked about. There was a question whether you think this would be a transitory thing, or is this whole distrust that has created a phenomenon that we will have to deal with for a long time. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I had a bunch of alarming headlines in there about the crisis of distrust and so on. And actually, when you look at public opinion polls, trust in science is pretty high. Trust in the medical community is pretty high all across the board. I mean, people don't trust politicians and journalists, but that's always been the case more or less. And so I think what people mean is that clearly trust is declining among some subgroups of individuals who've become distrustful of authority and distrustful of official institutions, but also that somehow, even though people get the information, they don't always trust it enough to change their behavior accordingly. I think this comes back to this distinction between trust and trustworthiness, that if you ask people in these polls, how much do you trust scientists? How much do you trust the WHO, EFSA? You're not really asking people, would you do you trust them to do what exactly, and so on, right? Would you trust a climate scientist to babysit your child? Probably not, right? But would you trust a climate scientist to tell you something about climate models? Probably. Would you trust a climate scientist to say something about policy, right? People get more divided over that. And so I think the context is really important for trying to measure trust. But, you know, I do think going forward, I think the most important thing that institutions can do, and also individual scientists, is demonstrating trustworthiness, which can only really be done through behavior. And sort of the universal signals that people from the psychology literature, that people seem to agree on, of what constitutes trustworthy behavior is transparency and honesty, and you know, a history of showing consistency in those factors. And I think part of transparency and honesty and things like competence and warmth. So in psychology, we distinguish sometimes between competence, which is, you know, being an expert, but also warmth, relating the science to what it means for people's sort of daily lives, is that you're transparent and honest about the quality of the evidence, the uncertainty, the underlying data, helping people, guiding them through the data mess that's out there. Only by having a consistent track record of doing that, without persuading people using tactics that then later gets them to distrust you less. I think that's the key challenge that lies ahead. And there have been some, you know, COVID's one, but there have been many cases of terrible risk communication where, you know, we said, oh, we know for certain that this is the problem, and then you know, turn out to be something else, and then we have to revise, and people stop trusting the communicator. And I think that's sort of the problem that we want to avoid by preempting the sort of idea of displaying trustworthy behavior.
Thanks, Sander. That's quite interesting. And talking about the communicating of institutions, so you talked about communicating sustainability in the context of Infarm and vertical farming. I think the communication you do is quite impressive. If I asked you to give a couple of tips to the EU actors that are trying to translate the EU sustainability commitments into public campaigns, what tips would you give them? If you could give 2 tips, 1 or 2 tips.
Okay, so I think that a counterintuitive tip that I would say is work with your competitors. Because again, if you're trying to create system change, you're trying to bring, you know, society at large into the sustainability message around whatever that sector is as they translate the EU mandate, work with your competitors and create that systems change. And they will have, of course, their own individual campaigns and policy attempts, etc., that will ladder up to something, but do some stuff together. It's not going to be easy, but it's necessary if you want to accelerate it. And in many cases, we need to accelerate a lot of this stuff.
Thanks, Suds. And we had a poll, and I'm going to give you the results of the poll now and ask you for a 30-minute reaction before we close. So basically, 30 seconds, sorry. I wished for a 30-minute, but we all need some coffee, I think. We had a question thinking about communication in digital age. Where would you invest most? Knowing the audience, creating attractive content, or expanding comms platforms? So knowing the audience and creative, attractive content were a tie. So quick comment on that, Michelle.
I think that's fair. I think those are the 2 things. If I, you know, after 20 years doing comms and then moving over to the kind of social research end of things, I think those are the 2 most compelling things you can possibly do. Know your audience, and then create stuff that actually works for them. Not attractive as in beautiful, although that before that we saw was very beautiful, but frame your content in the style, format, language, and messenger that actually works best and most compellingly for that audience. Thank you. Suds?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's really 2 sides of the same coin. I mean, in terms of knowing, you know, what the audience wants and creating the content for that is probably 101 marketing and communication. Right? Like you need to know what you're addressing and why. So, makes sense to me.
Great, Sander.
Yeah, I also agree. You know, tailoring your message to the right audience is obviously very important. I think the creative is so interesting because it presents a bit of a practical challenge. You know, we've worked for example, here in the UK with the government, and you know, one of the questions about how to implement these rules for risk communication was, okay, but how can you be open, transparent, uncertainty, quality, everything in 2 sentences on social media? Because that's risk communication in the digital age, and I think that the risk is that in the digital age, all nuance gets lost on social media. So how can you still be creative and also nuanced? I think that's the key question.
And that's, on that thought, I think a take-home thought, something we all can ponder about. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sander. Thank you, Suds. We will now break for coffee, and we will come back here at 4:30 for a final panel discussion before we close the session. Thank you for all of those here and online, and a big applause to our speakers, please. Welcome back. Thank you for participating in the first part of our session. And we are here now to the closing part of the session on the future of social science in one policymaking, which will be on paving the road for social science in the future of the One Health. If I may kindly get the slides, I just wanted to give you a quick primer, which is something that EFSA has recently finalized the Eurobarometer survey, and we will be publishing it in September. And I wanted to show you an interesting piece of work from the survey, which was, if we could get the technicians to project kindly the slide on the big screen. Actually, we recently asked EU citizens about their perceived impact of animal, plant, and environmental issues on human health. And we actually see that 9 out of 10 Europeans perceive that there is, to some extent, an impact of both animal, plant, and environmental issues on human health. And this is just something that we will publish this in September, but I wanted to give you a feel on also the public opinion on the importance of the One Health concept. With that, I pass the floor and introduce you to the moderator of our panel discussion today, which is Professor Ragnar Lofsted, Professor of Risk Management and the Director of King Center for Risk Management, where he teaches and conducts research on risk communication. Ragnar, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Domagoj. So the title of this session is Paving the Road for the Future Role of Society in One Policy Making. In other words, what are the next steps? I'm going to be chair of this session. It's a very short, 25 minutes, and I'm hoping it's going to be very, very interactive. We have 4 panelists, 2 online and 2 in person. And as one of the panelists basically will be leaving us shortly, I'm going to go straight away to the question for Anna Persic from UNESCO in Paris. Anna, are you with us? Is Anna?
Apologies that I have to leave earlier.
Is she with us? Good.
Yes.
Anna, in the context of the global commitment of opening up science, who will need to contribute the most? What will be the role of institutions working in the natural sciences, if any? What's your take on that?
We were talking about open science a little bit earlier in the session, and the point is that to make open science really happen, there is a lot of people that have to get involved. I wouldn't go to say who needs to contribute more. I think the important thing is to understand who needs to contribute, and all of those need to actually contribute, because it will not work if one of the actors don't contribute, whether it's scientists, natural, social sciences, on the individual level, at institutional level, whether it's publishers, whether it's engineers, whether it's other actors, data scientists, everybody really, that funders, governments, everybody needs to contribute. Otherwise, it will not happen.
And will they?
I really do hope so, because, I mean, they have the recommendation as far as the governments are concerned. And then I think that little by little, people are starting to also see the benefits of opening science more to society.
So you are an optimist then?
I am an optimist, definitely.
Good. Okay, thank you very much, and have a good afternoon. So next up, thank you. Next up is Dolores Montserrat, who is a member of European Parliament from Spain. So you have been highly active in the European Parliament's Environmental Committee. As we are discussing next steps, the question I have for you: what kind of social scientific as well as risk communication help do you think that the EP-ENVI committee needs to have right now? What is the role of academics? What's the role of civil servants? What's the role of other social scientists in this room? How can we best help you and your committee?
Hello.
It is now.
Now, yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with you. First of all, we have to help each other. We have to work together. All the institutions, all the society, all the scientifics. But for me, one of the most important things that we have to work together is promoting our European way of life. I think that this we are doing in the European Parliament, but it means investing in people's health and well-being while building a stronger, more cohesive and more resilient European societies and respecting the environment. The second important thing is we start to put the first tools on the European Union for health. So the European Union, we have competence with the finance, with the banks, with just one money, the euro, but we don't have any competence with health. And after the COVID time, we learn a lot of lessons. And the first lesson is without fear, we have to join with the state members, European Union for Health. Why? Because we have to be more prepared for the future, and like that, we are going to give more health, more public health to all the citizens. Then, third important thing is we have to invest so much in European space health data. We have to join a big data health in all Europe. Why? Because it's going to help to us to have more data to work better with the prevention, with the treatments, with the research. And then, important thing, I think that now we are starting, and after the COVID time, we are starting the decade of health and research. Not just Europe wants to lead the fight against climate change. We want to lead the digitalization, but of course that now we have a big opportunity all together to lead in the world the taking care of the public health. So I think that now starts the decade of health and research. And the last thing, in the European Parliament, we create the new COVID committee. I have the privilege that I'm the rapporteur of this COVID committee, and this committee wants to mark a difference between before and after the pandemic in the policy making. So we want to be prepared and never again. If again one day we have another health emergency, we have to be prepared without fear, in the sense that, imagine, a state member, no, I have the competence of health, don't tell me what I have to do. No, I think that we have to work all together, and from the European Union and our institutions, we have to coordinate with the state members, because just like that, we are going to give safety and sure to all the citizens that now it's one of the most, if we are looking the survey that the European Parliament is doing always, the first concern for the European citizens is the economy, and the second one is health. Yeah. So I think so that we have to work all together in these 4 points. And
we can't blame them, actually. In the 2 years of pandemic, it's 2 years far too long, frankly.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next up is Sander van der Linden from the University of Cambridge. So Sander, we see from a number of studies, for example, the Eurobarometer, that people connect animal, plant, and environment to human health. Personally, for example, during the 2-year pandemic, I spent a year in my Swedish forest, and that was the best place to be, I can assure you, during a pandemic. So did you think that the COVID pandemic contributed to this finding, firstly? And then secondly, what further research do we need to do in this area? Sander, please.
So if I understand correct, Ragnar, you're asking about the connection between
animals, plant, and environment to human health. We basically like being out in nature, and that's more and more now because of the course of COVID. Do you agree with that? And secondly, what more research can we do in this area?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I do think, there's long-standing research that highlights the benefits of spending time in nature, but there's all sorts of studies from psychology that point to the negative effects of isolation on people's mental health and also on development in children, especially being socially isolated. And also physically isolated, and so I think spending time in nature, as you mentioned, you in the Swedish forest, I do think it can provide an important relief for people, both in terms of their mental as well as in their physical health. And so I think there's quite a bit of research, maybe not so much during the pandemic, although studies have been conducted that people who have had more access to nature and outdoors had improved outcomes in both physical and mental health. So there's a bit of data there, but I think generally there's quite a strong argument to make for those benefits. And in terms of the research that's needed in that area, I think I was the editor of the Journal of Environmental Psychology for a while, so I have some sense of the type of research that's conducted, and I think really though what's missing are large-scale randomized controlled trials that really show population-level health outcome effects of these sorts of connections, because most of these studies are actually small sample, opt-in individuals, not highly controlled. The environments often fluctuate a lot. So I think actually, some really high-level population trials that are high quality that can shed light on the exact benefits of these sort of things. Because I'm sure it's also contextual that it might matter more for some people than others based on the type of location. Just to end on an anecdote, I don't know about Sweden, Ragnar, but in the Netherlands, there's now the emerging concept of cow cuddling. I'm not sure if you've heard of this.
Cow cuddling.
Yeah. People. It's a bit tongue in cheek here, but it's a real. There's a real phenomenon. It's a wellness phenomenon. So people go to the farms and they cuddle the cows, and apparently their heart rate slows down and they feel all good, and you get a nice glass of champagne with the cows, and it's a whole thing. I haven't tried it myself, but we need more data.
Thank you very much. So cow cuddling in the Netherlands, there you go. I put like moose cuddling in Sweden then. Okay, so finally up is
bit prickly.
James Ramsey. James is the head of communications at EFSA. James, thank you for coming up to the podium. So for the past few years, EFSA has had a social science function, which I, for one, certainly welcome. Why was such a function established? And what have been a couple of concrete contributions that it has made to the One Health, One Environment framework? James, please.
Thanks very much, Ragnar. So, well, actually, the starting point for us, as far as risk communications is concerned, basically, we say the relevance of our risk communications, and by extension, our risk assessment, is enhanced if we have a solid understanding of the expectations, concerns of our audiences, those with whom we intend to communicate. In other words, the more we know about those concerns and expectations, the more we know about the risk perception of our audiences, the more likely we are to provide them with information in a way that is meaningful and relevant to them. This is important. Obviously, we're an EU body, so we're handling public money. We work in the public interest. It's important that we do the work that we do in a way that is meaningful and relevant for our target audiences. And I think there's also an element of building trust as well. If we're able to reflect, hold up a mirror, if you like, to the concerns of society through the work that we do, we also help to establish ourselves as a trustworthy organization. From a more practical point of view, we use social science at EFSA as a way of helping to prioritize what we work on and what we communicate on. Obviously, we're an organization that is working across a whole range of scientific topics. We have a far-reaching mandate and limited resources. So we need to make decisions about which topics, which issues are of interest to our audience, and we use social science tools and methodologies to help us prioritize our risk communications. So in actual fact, we've applied this kind of general approach ever since EFSA began working 20 years ago, by the way. So we're celebrating our anniversary this year. But it's only really relatively recently that we've started to get a bit more sophisticated with the way that we use these tools. So whereas in the past we might have rather crude approaches, relying, for example, on solely on media monitoring, what we can pick up from media monitoring, or what we see in web analytics about how our customers or how our target audiences are interacting with our work. Now we have a much better picture using social science and using social research of what our audiences want and need to hear from us. So this is why, as an organization, we made a conscious decision to invest in social science as a function, if you like, and we're already seeing the benefits of this.
So at the next one conference in 4 years' time, say, where are we then in terms of the social science expertise at EFSA? If you had a carte blanche, what would you want to see? What would you want to have? A unit of 30 social scientists doing food stuff?
There are some in my unit who would like to see this. Certainly the social science function would like to continue to grow and grow like this. I would like to see certainly that we continue in the direction we're going already. I see, as I said, a lot of benefit in incorporating social research, social science into the world of risk communication, also from a practitioner point of view. I would like to see this, we call it the audience-first approach within EFSA, and this is, and we're basically looking to develop in a more coordinated way the communication, the risk communication that we do. So to focus on specific areas, and we can talk certainly in terms of One Health. So we have very interesting things coming up. We're running campaigns at the moment on animal health issues. We communicate a lot around topics like antimicrobial resistance. We have an exciting new communications campaign, awareness-raising campaign on plant health risks coming up. So to move more in this direction, where we're incorporating social science techniques into the large-scale coordinated communication activities that we do.
Thank you. We've got a question online. It's with Dolores. It's basically, the quote is, all we have to do is work together. But this was also the main theme after World War II, and over the last 7 decades, we have seen that it did not work at all, and that the interests of many groups, industry, countries do not align. So how can this work? See, obviously, this person is more of a pessimist than you are, saying basically we cannot work together.
Well, I'm optimist. The European Union is a story of successful, and when more European Union demonstrate to our citizens is in crisis moment, as we lived this past with the COVID time. When arrives the COVID, the pandemic all around the world and in Europe, we didn't have any competence. Each state member has their own competence on health, public health. In the European Union, our treaty, we have just 2 articles that they are talking about borders, public health, but not how to manage. So what we did in this record time in 1.5 years to harmonize, do a good coordination in the European Union institutions with the state members, investing in a vaccination, in a new vaccine, doing a joint procurement, a European joint procurement on vaccination, on vaccines, no? And then to do a massive vaccination in all European Union, and in the same time with our solidarity value of European Union, we export a lot of vaccination in the rest of the world. This is a big example that the European Union, when we want, we can do it. And the way it's all together. So I'm optimist, and I want to say to Anton Oberhuisen that we can do it. And of course that we have to do it without fear, without mental borders. I've been former Minister of Health in Spain, and it is true that when you are having that point of view from one state member, and the European Union is saying, well, you know, I don't want the competence, but we have to harmonize. You as a state member, you are thinking, oh, well, you know, what we have to change, it's going to be so difficult to change. But then, when it happens, like the COVID, it's incredible what we achieve together, all the 27 state members with the European Union. And it is true that at the beginning of the COVID time, we saw nationalist decisions from the state members, because first they thought in each state member, but then after 1 month they thought, look, you know, let's do it all together, let's fight against this pandemic, against the COVID all together. So we can do it, and this is the reason that I was explaining before. It's very important to build the European Union for health without fear, without mental borders. And for me, very important, it is to start to join this space of European health data, that this is going to help so much in all the disease and public health. So we can do it, and let's do it. This decade is a big opportunity, not just to fight against the climate change, not just to push for European Union more digitalization, no? We have all together to fight for 1 decade of research, invest, public health. We can achieve it. So I'm sure that at the end, the citizens, we are going, you know, to achieve better health, better environment, and better planet, so better state members and better Europe. So I'm so optimistic, and I hope so that I convince Anton.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question is for Xander. So we now had a discussion all day on social science. What advice would you give EFSA and other European agencies in terms of what they should do now in the social science space? Should we have more, do you think we should have more scientific advisory bodies in terms of social science, advising the European agencies? What do you see as an academic? What would you want to have happen at these agencies in Europe?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I'm sure you experience the same, but often there is sometimes a sense of frustration about matters of communication, and I think it would be great if there was actually some, you know, not sort of only traditional panels of social scientists, but a way for social scientists to dynamically advise and provide input on the way that reports are circulated and created and risks are communicated, to actually sort of have a live or kind of a standby panel of some sorts of social scientists that they could tap with specific advice and questions on matters of risk and communication. Just because, you know, I just talked about the digital age, I think trends are so fast evolving now that this whole process of having working groups and taking years to write reports, I think we need a new system where we have more dynamic and flexible ways of using the expertise of social scientists and finding ways of embedding such structures in the EFSA process and of that of similar organizations, I think could be tremendously useful. Whether that's through consultations or virtual opportunities or shorter written responses that can be provided, or actually opportunities for more opportunities for social sciences to learn more about the problems that organizations like EFSA are experiencing by spending some time at EFSA or having these sort of rotating types of fellowships could be interesting. Because I also think that there's often a disconnect between what the social scientists are doing and asking and the types of questions that EFSA might need to have an answer to. So, for example, I could say something about verbal quantifiers of uncertainty, but if the problem is that there was a specific type of food product and there's a risk to be communicated, and there's a an urgent situation, we haven't tested how how particular language works for a particular food product in a particular country or area. But we can conduct such experiments now all the time, and we do this for certain organizations, right? When the government wants to test something, we can actually run the experiment using the exact type of message that they're thinking of putting it out there, and advise the government before they put it out, so we can prevent misunderstandings of risk in science. And we can actually run real-time experiments using the templates and the communication plans that organizations have to get not some creative. Nothing to say bad about creative consulting companies, but to get scientific input on the message and not just the creative input. And I think that's where it could be particularly useful.
So we need more workshops like this then, Sander?
Absolutely, yes.
Good, perfect. Okay, and this is not a final question. So are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to introducing more science to European citizens? I mean, before you answer that question, I'm going to say my view. Personally, I'm a pessimist following the removal of so many science news editors from quality newspapers and television channels. Are you guys optimists or pessimists? And we're starting with Sander, then James, and finally Dolores. Sander, go ahead. Are you an optimist or pessimist, or are you going to hedge yourself and you'll be a bit of both?
I'm fairly optimistic. I would say I'm fairly optimistic. I mean, I can see the reasons why people are pessimistic, but in the long term, I'm optimistic that we can cultivate a better global understanding of the scientific process. So, do you want me to elaborate, or do you want
one more sentence? One more sentence.
Okay, yeah. So I think that ultimately, I think what's needed is for people to cultivate a mindset where we're comfortable with the idea of uncertainty in science, and B, see science as something that's emerging and evolving and updating our beliefs in light of new evidence. I think people tend to think that science is static without any uncertainty. And I think those are the key parameters that we can change. And if that happens, I think we can be fairly optimistic that people will welcome a scientific understanding more. But whether we can actually do that, perhaps that's something to be pessimistic about. But I'm fairly optimistic.
We're going to try. We're going to try. Very good. James?
Yeah, thanks. I follow Sanders there. I'm also an optimist, very much so. I would have to say that in my position, of course, but I see it happening in the work that we do as well, particularly when it comes to coordinated communications, when we're working with with partners in the member states. The impact that the communications around scientific issues can have, the understanding that it helps to build about scientific process. I think COVID has had a big effect on that. The science in the public discourse, as we discussed previously in this session, has certainly risen, and that there will always be naysayers. There will always be people. There will be echo chambers where the scientific process is never understood and never wants to be understood. But generally speaking, I think there is there's fertile ground for science to be brought to the people, if you like, and there's a good role that EFSA and other similar organizations can play.
Okay, thank you. Dolores?
I said before, really optimist. Yeah, really optimist. And perhaps, I can describe in three words. Pragmatic, we have to be pragmatics, then, with legitimacy, and then we have to fight against the fake news and the misinformation.
Yeah.
For me, this is very, very important. So first, the people need to feel safe and secure to prosper. They need clear, simple answers, concrete solutions to the problems affecting their lives, together with pragmatic visions for the future. So we have to be pragmatics. Second thing, to trust our policies to make it relevant in their life and in their plans for the future of their children. They need to be correctly informed. They have to know and understand everything. So this is the reason that we have to fight against the fake news and the misinformation. And the third thing, very important, it's always all the environment and health policies we have to take that decisions always by scientific evidence, always. So I think these 3 points.
Okay,
it's important.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all 3 panelists for coming this afternoon for a great discussion. And I want to thank you, the audience, for being here all afternoon, all day. Actually, really much appreciated, especially when the weather is so nice outside. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming, and I'm going to hand the final word to Domagoj. Please, Domagoj.
Thank you, and a warm word of thank you to the panelists for this really productive panel that came at the end of a very interesting discussion. I just want to say 3 things. The first thing is, as a social scientist, I felt very proud today, and I want to dedicate this session to all the social scientists working around the world in regulatory organizations and all of those communication professionals that work to deliver the relevant audience message to the audiences that require scientific support. So for that, I'm really proud, and I want to dedicate the session. Second, I really want to thank all of the contributors to the sessions, and big thanks to Dolores and James for being here, and Sander and Anna, and thanks to Ragnar for facilitating this panel, and many thanks to all of the contributors to the session. And last but not least, I want to thank you for attending and listening to us, and we will be happy to share all the materials with you after this session. I wrap up by giving a special thanks to my colleague Giorgia Zamariola, who helped me so much to prepare this session. A big applause for everyone, and thank you for being here. And a word of reminder, we will have 15 to 30 minutes of post-session lounge, and Michelle and I will be available to talk to the participants online in case you wish to do so. Thank you.